From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm Marcus Brauchley of the Washington Post. We're one of the charter sponsors of the National Book Festival. Big believers in reading, as you can imagine. On behalf of the Library of Congress, I'd like to welcome you to the Book Festival. We hope you're having a good day. I want to inform you that the presentations here at the pavilion are being filmed for the Library of Congress website and for their archives. If you don't want to be part of history, you might not want to ask questions. And by C-SPAN for airing on Book TV. Please be mindful of this as you enjoy the presentation. Also, please stay away from the risers where the cameras are in the back, unless you want a camera to topple on you. And please turn off your cell phones, pagers, or other devices that might disturb the person sitting next to you. It's a special privilege to be introducing a writer for whom I have really the greatest admiration. David Hoffman is a longtime reporter and editor for the Washington Post. He's one of the hardest working, most passionate believers in the power of good journalism to change the world, and he's been a mentor to some of our finest foreign correspondents. He's here today to talk about his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Dead Hand. It's a chilling account of the last days of the Cold War and how that era still ominously shadows us all. It's an extraordinary piece of reporting on previously unknown documents and conversations, both from this country and from Russia, where David was stationed for the Post. Before David mastered the illuminated texts of the Soviet Union, he had already visited the Stations of the Cross in the monastic world of Washington journalism. He covered the White House in the Reagan and George H.W. Bush administrations. He was the Post's diplomatic correspondent and its Jerusalem correspondent, and he served as assistant managing editor for Foreign News. It was during that last stint, which would be arduous enough for most of us, that he managed to write this book. Maybe he was able to do that because the subject of this book, which David captures brilliantly, is urgent and compelling. Please join me in welcoming David Hoffman.
Marcus, thank you very much, and thanks to everybody for coming on what I hope is going to be a really interesting and exciting day. This book grew out of work that I did in Moscow as the Washington Post correspondent there from 1995 until 2001. I really apologize for this hoarse voice, but I'll try and make myself very, very clear. When I was the correspondent in Moscow as American newspaper reporter, I kept the doors of our Moscow bureau open, and oftentimes people who were visiting Russia for the United States government, for scholars and others would come to our bureau because they knew the door would be open. We'd like to listen to their experiences there, serve them tea and cookies. And one day a man came to see me in the autumn of 1998. The door was open. I'd never met him before. It was a very, very sad and sullen time in Moscow, early autumn like today. Only a few weeks before, Russia defaulted on its debts and devalued the ruble. The great capitalist experiment of those years seemed to be crashing around everybody. Lines were forming outside of banks. People couldn't get their money out of the bank. The money they had been given, the bills, the rubles, were suddenly worth much less. They were very, very upset, and people didn't really know what to do. This man came to my office and he said, "David, I work for the United States Department of Energy, and my job is to go and check all the nuclear facilities here in Moscow to make sure that all the nuclear materials, the highly enriched uranium and the plutonium, is locked up." And I said, "Well, that's really interesting work. How do you do that?" And he said, "Well, I have this checklist, and I go to each place where there's uranium and plutonium, and I run down the list. I make sure, for example, the locks are properly on the doors, and that the video cameras are working so we can make sure nobody takes the uranium. And we have portal monitors and scales." And all this equipment was purchased by the United States government in the 1990s. And given to Russia to make sure that nobody took the bomb-grade uranium out of these institutes, that nobody, no terrorists, could take any of this material, which was laying all over the country, 1,200 tons of highly enriched uranium spread across 11 time zones. But the man told me, he said, today, this very day, I've had a terribly upsetting and unsettling experience. And I served him some more tea, and I said, tell me about it. Well, today I was at the Institute of Theoretical and Experimental Physics. And I said, that's a beautiful institute. It's spread out over 89 acres in the middle of Moscow. And it's an old nuclear research institute started in the Soviet days. And what did you find there, I asked him. And he said, well, you know, I took my checklist. I made sure the locks were on the doors. Spread out over this institute in small buildings, the nuclear researchers would do their work with highly enriched uranium that was brought to them in metal cans about the size of a coffee can. The uranium was inside, and it was clad in aluminum on the outside. And there was a lot of uranium. There was enough to make many, many bombs spread over this 89 acres. And as the man went through his checklist that day, he found the locks were working, the video cameras were working, the portal monitors were working, everything, all the equipment was working. But he was shocked to find out something had gone wrong. Something had gone catastrophically wrong that we had never thought of. Because all over the Institute, he found out, because the economic situation in the country had started to fall apart, that all the guards, all the people responsible for watching the uranium, from preventing it from being stolen, were gone. The guards had walked off their jobs because they hadn't been paid. The video monitors were running and nobody was watching it. This fellow, who was very young, sent by the Energy Department to check all these things, had been given some cash by the Energy Department, his per diem, to pay for his food every day. And he was walking around wondering, how do I do something about this? What do I do? He called all the scientists at the Institute, all the secretaries, anybody left he could find, into one room. There were only 32 people he could find on the 89 acres. None of them were guards. He reached into his pocket and he took out all the money the Department of Energy had given him, $3,000 in $100 bills, and he put it on the center of the table and he said, will you please stay here until I can get help? And they did, because they cared too that the uranium not be stolen. And later, the United States and Russia found the money to bring the guards back. But when this man told me this story, I thought, you know, this is 1998, 7 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And there are still coffee cans of highly enriched uranium laying unguarded around Moscow. The Cold War had been over for a long time. And I began to research how this came about. Why and how was it so much stuff was laying around? And that's what gave rise to this book. And it's the story, really, of how this enormous amount of dangerous material, which was generated in the Cold War, was dealt with after the Cold War ended. And it was a scary story, and one that didn't follow a script. Oftentimes our politicians told us everything was going to be okay. We've gone in there, we've secured the reactors, we've secured the weapons facilities, but it wasn't the case. Now, I got lucky in doing this research because I found the records inside the Kremlin of many of the decisions that they had made. And one of the things I was determined to do was to ask the Russians, as well as the Americans, what was this story like to you in terms of what was happening on both sides? We tend to forget the Cold War today, but it was a colossal confrontation of two sides. And much of the history that was written about the Cold War after it ended was written only from one side, from the American perspective. It's not uncommon. Our society is open. Our books are written. Many of our documents were available. But what about on the Soviet side, the evil empire that Reagan called it? What were their decisions really, really like? What were they saying to each other? at the end of the Cold War. And one of the advantages I had in this book was to receive the papers from inside their decision-making process, from inside their Kremlin, to try and recreate the history in stereo, to listen and try and understand what happened from both sides as they lived it. A discovery that I made was that it didn't look like the normal narrative that we had been told. It looked different. We have read books and heard that we won the Cold War and they lost, right? Simple. We all know Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative won the Cold War and bankrupted the Soviet Union, right? But actually, when you begin to reconstruct the history, as I did, you realize that it wasn't like that at all. Actually, the papers and records and interviews show that the Soviets were afraid of the Strategic Defense Initiative and they were worried about Reagan. But that country imploded of its own dysfunction, of its own failures. And I'd like to just share with you two very brief glimpses of how this history looks different in retrospect. The first one is about that Star Wars plan, missile defense, that Reagan himself announced in 1983. You all read today headlines about missile defense. We're all still trying to make up our minds whether you can hit a missile with a missile and shoot a bullet with a bullet out of the sky. But when Reagan announced this in 1983, the Soviets were very, very fearful, and Reagan was very, very confident. And in fact, if you read the literature now about the end of the Cold War, the books are very triumphalist. Reagan himself was the triumphalist. He said, this is what caused the end of the Cold War. But my friends, I'd just like to share with you a discovery I made. I don't want to take away from Reagan, and I'll come back to him in a second, but the real impact of Reagan's Star Wars was not that he forced the Soviet Union to build one and to be like us and to go toe-to-toe with us. The reality is that Mikhail Gorbachev, the new leader of the Soviet Union in March of 1985, was pressured and asked repeatedly by the people in his military, by all those very, very powerful guys who built rockets and space vehicles and tanks, to build a Soviet Star Wars. If Gorbachev hadn't come along, I'm sure Brezhnev would have built one. As I said, the Cold War was a collision between two huge blocs. But this time, it would be different. Even as Reagan was making his speeches, including his second inaugural speech given on this mall in January of 1985, even as Reagan was saying, we will make nuclear weapons obsolete with our Star Wars, Gorbachev was wondering what the hell to do. What should he do? Everybody was telling him he had to do the same thing. And he made a very, very courageous decision, which is explained in my book and in these documents. Mikhail Gorbachev decided not to compete, not to build a Star Wars, not to continue the Cold War. And he decided it early. He decided it in 1985 and 86. And this was the first turning point that led really to the end of the Cold War and allowed many of us to see the end of that enormous, expensive, frightful, and draining confrontation. So it wasn't only Reagan's plan to force the Soviets to collapse. They also made some courageous decisions. But you know, I was a White House correspondent when Reagan was president. I even covered his 1980 campaign for president. I was a good reporter in terms of taking down everything the president said in my notebooks. For years, I traveled around behind Reagan, taking notes, what he said, trying to understand who was this man, what did he mean. And I have to tell you that as I began to go through the records in writing this book and reading President Reagan's own diaries, which are now published, I found a shocking discovery. I found that contrary to many of the things I believed and understood in following Reagan, that he, like Gorbachev, wanted to end the nuclear arms race. I found out that Reagan, in his deepest emotions and beliefs, wanted to really abolish nuclear weapons. and that he wanted to do it long before the rest of us found out, years before we found out. And certainly I, as a reporter, I went back to my files. I looked at all of my own stories, and you won't find it in my stories out of the White House in the 1980s. I didn't know. None of us knew. So this wonderful combination of Gorbachev's determination to change the direction and Reagan's hope and dream of abolishing nuclear weapons led us to the end of the Cold War, which you saw we almost got even in 1986 at the summit at Reykjavik, a dramatic moment. Now, my last point is to tell you that this sounds like a very optimistic and promising story and a good outcome, but the documents also revealed something that was the underside of the Cold War, a dark side. I found in these records evidence of how the Soviet Union had quietly and in violation of all their treaty obligations built the largest biological weapons program that mankind had ever seen. And in my book, I document how scientists, thousands of them, in hidden institutes and laboratories, were ordered by the Kremlin to create biological weapons that were unstoppable. They tried to take germs and create hybrids that would cause illness and sickness, for which there would be no antidotes, there would be no vaccines, there would be no antibiotics. And this effort proceeded for years and cost billions of dollars, and ultimately the Soviet Union built giant factories to produce these germs. And I remind you, sure you've read, that anthrax in a tiny little powder can be very poisonous. It only takes a few tiny little spores. The Soviet Union built a factory which, upon given the orders from Moscow, could produce 300 pounds of anthrax a year, enough to wipe out every living thing on this earth. This factory was up and running in exactly the time that Mikhail Gorbachev became president. And one of the big mysteries of the time is, what did Mr. Gorbachev, the great statesman who tried to stop the nuclear arms race, what did he do about the germs in the basement? What did he do about the biological weapons that his country had built? Well, in the end, he didn't do anything. He let it continue, and when the Soviet Union ended, when it collapsed, Americans, like the friend who had come to visit me that very first day with their checklist, went and they discovered it. And the book ends with the story of how the Americans uncovered this diabolical program and factories to build germ weapons to attack us in the Cold War. And it was a very, very frightening time because we didn't know if these factories would be activated. We didn't know if they could really work. Huge fermenters, 4 stories tall, sitting there in the desert of Kazakhstan waiting to be started. And this entire history has a lesson for us today, because these horrible, evil weapons were created in a confrontation between 2 political blocs and 2 leaders, and it persisted for decades. And we have to ask ourselves today, why did it stop? Why did it end? And why did it persist? And one of the reasons was because of the incredible mistrust that the United States and the Soviet Union could not see each other clearly. We didn't understand each other's intentions, ways of life, ambitions. And we have to ask ourselves today, are we going to get in another Cold War with somebody else because of mistrust? The lessons of what happened between Reagan and Gorbachev are things we should think about today when our leaders say that we're going to stop Iran from building nuclear weapons. We didn't see Gorbachev clearly, nor did Gorbachev see Reagan clearly. And I ask you today, do we know what's really happening in North Korea? Do we know what's happening in Iran, what the leaders are thinking? Well, the book will offer you some insight into the dangers of not knowing, of the dark side of the Cold War. So I'd be happy to take your questions, and thanks for coming today.
While you were in Russia, what role did you see church played, the Orthodox Church and then all other religious groups?
The Orthodox Church in Russia in the 1990s was weakened by the 7 decades of Soviet rule. The Soviet Union did not completely eliminate the church. It existed, even though the state was officially atheist. But in the first decade after the Union collapsed, it was impossible for the church to get back on its feet quickly. So it was a time when many churches were renovated, but the church itself didn't play a big role in people's lives. It will take many years for that to happen. I'll go back and forth.
What's your view of Gorbachev's organization today, Global Green, or it's called Green Cross internationally, destroying chemical and other weapons? And what's also your thoughts on the Soviet nuclear waste and mess, and the recent book that's out on saying Chernobyl actually has caused close to 1 million deaths?
First of all, I think any organization that's dedicated to cleaning up the legacy of the Cold War deserves our support. I ask you all, does anybody here know how many nuclear warheads remain in the world today? Can anybody give me the number? What do you think? Do you think there's 5,000 left from the Cold War? No, 10,000, not nearly enough. There are 23,000 nuclear warheads today. 95% of them are held by the United States and Russia. We have a lot of work to do to get to global zero, but I think even getting down to 100 on each side wouldn't be a bad bargain when we have 23,000 left. So I think highly of groups that are working to reduce this legacy, which we don't need anymore. The Cold War is over. And the second question was about Chernobyl. The records suggest that it's very hard to understand the impact of radiation on human health. 30 or 40 people actually died in the accident, but a large amount of radiation was spewed across Europe and Scandinavia. And I just don't think anybody knows how many deaths were really caused by it. But Chernobyl was a wake-up call. It should remind us that if we have 23,000 nuclear warheads laying around, there's always the possibility of an accident. And I think while they're well secured and ours are secured, Chernobyl wasn't supposed to happen either. They were running a test on the reactor and someone made a mistake and it blew up. What will be the next accident?
How did the CIA get it so wrong for so long, the strength of the Soviet economy?
You know, the CIA's error here in judging the Soviet Union was not so much misjudging the strength of their economy. It was misjudging the impact of the weakness of their economy on their military and on their defenses. In other words, we saw the evidence with our own eyes that there were bread lines. You remember the dysfunctional, failing nature of socialism. We could see that in the news reports, that Soviet consumers were hungry to buy jeans on the street. They had never had a factory that made jeans, right? But what we didn't understand was that corrosive failure of socialism also was cutting into the rocket forces, cutting into the missiles, was making them unable to actually launch anything. And frankly, the Korean airliner that was shot down in 1983, that horrible tragedy, was shot down by mistake because their radars didn't even work properly. So the error here, and the error that Reagan made himself, was that we wanted to see that socialism was failing and we wanted capitalism to triumph, and we understood breadlines, but we saw the military as 10 feet tall. And they weren't. They suffered the same malaise, the same dysfunction. And that was hard to grasp. It was a time of secrecy, a time of spies, a time of great confrontation. I don't know that we should fault the CIA per se. Nobody saw it because they hid their weakness behind that mistrust and secrecy. Which side am I on? I forgot.
How do you view the New START Treaty, and how do you think it compares to START Treaty?
Well, I just finished saying that there are 23,000 nuclear warheads left. Here's a new treaty that will come to 1,550 on each side, right? So it sounds like a good deal. That's only 3,000 some altogether, except we're going to put a whole lot of them in storage and not count them. This treaty ought to be ratified, But don't fool yourself. The job is not finished. When it's over, there's still going to be another 10 or 15,000 in storage. I'm sorry, but if you just put another name on it and say it's a nuclear weapon in storage, you haven't made the world safer. We have more work to do after the treaty.
You mentioned Iran toward the end of your talk. How do you feel the uranium that is still floating around has impacted what's going on in Iran today, and how does it affect what's going on in the Middle East?
Well, as a general statement, we'll all be a lot safer if no more countries obtain nuclear weapons and decide to use them and build them and test them. Now, how they get the uranium, the difficult process of understanding what their thought process, why do they want the bomb, who are their enemies, we need to think about that. We cannot always see Iran as some kind of a boogeyman like we did the Soviet Union. It requires us to be more sophisticated to understand what the leadership really wants by this. But whether North Korea or Iran or someplace else, the fewer the better.
Would you comment on the role that President Herbert Walker Bush played during the collapse of the Soviet Union to the satellite nations?
I describe in the book that President George Herbert Walker Bush, whom I covered, was very close and understood what Reagan had done in the last years of Reagan's presidency, and he didn't want to do the same thing. While Reagan was a nuclear abolitionist, Bush was not. Bush was much more of a conventional nuclear deterrence guy. That had been his upbringing. So the first thing he did really in 1989, in that historic year of change of 1989, is he put the brakes on. He slowed everything down. And I think it was a mistake. It was a pause in everything that was going on in 1989 when there was a great chance for him to strike a deal with Gorbachev to exploit everything that Reagan had done. But by the end of 1989, the Berlin Wall fell down. It was pretty hard to ignore the signs of change. And then Bush got into gear in 1990. And in many ways, I think Bush himself saw himself as a president who represented prudence, a word that he loved, caution. And it was a time of enormous change, and he was not a person of enormous change. He did what he thought was the right thing at that time.
A couple of things. What happened to the biological weapons that they had in the Soviet Union? And also, when you talk about the lack of knowledge with what's happening in Iran and North Korea, are you suggesting maybe greater engagement or possible military action?
On the biological weapons of the Soviet Union, many of them have been destroyed. We found the factories thanks to the courageous work of some Americans who I describe in the book. We bulldozed some of those factories, but not all of them. There are 3 biological weapons laboratories remaining inside Russia today that have never been opened to the West. Nobody knows what's going on inside. Our program was closed down by Richard Nixon in 1969. We obeyed the treaty. The Soviet Union and Russia also signed the treaty. It's time for them to come clean. I'm against military action against Iran. I don't think it will help anything. We've got 2 wars going on. I don't think we need a third. And in terms of engagement, yes, I always come back to the kind of engagement Reagan argued for, even in the height of the Cold War. We talked to the Soviet leaders. We had an embassy in Moscow. We do not have one in Tehran. Why is it we can't have the same engagement? But Reagan always said, trust, but verify. Well, if we're cautious, there's no reason we can't engage further with Iran.
We have time for one more question.
Okay. So you talked about materials. What about the scientists and the know-how?
We know very little what happened to the scientists. An American program was started to help the scientists. It was estimated there were 60,000 scientists with weapons knowledge, and they're at the core, and we had to help them. We don't know how many. We reached some of them. They got small stipends or grants. We tried to help, but nobody knows what really happened to all the know-how to this day. Thank you all very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.